Something happened that night. Something so grave, so irreversible, that it forced me to decide whether I would stand with my daughter or stand with the truth. Before I walk you into the shadow of that choice, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Janet, a woman who has lived long enough to know that life brings moments where silence becomes a decision and truth becomes a turning point. Greetings, my dear friends. Before I share this heartwarming story with you, I want to ask for a small favor. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard, and drop a comment letting me know which state or city you're listening from. It would warm my heart to know how far my voice has traveled. Get comfortable. Happy listening. Now, let me take you back to that night. I remember the sound first, the sudden, frantic knock that seemed to cut through the quiet of my home like a warning I wasn't prepared to hear. When I opened the door, my daughter stood there, not speaking, not crying, only holding a silence that carried a weight I had never felt from her before. She stepped inside without looking at me, as if the walls of my house could protect her from something waiting outside. Her voice came slowly, broken into pieces, each word heavy but incomplete, as though she feared saying too much would unravel her. She told me she had made a mistake, one she could not take back, yet the details stayed locked behind her shaking breath. Instead of explaining, she pleaded. She wanted safety. She wanted distance from whatever followed her. She wanted me to help her turn away from something she had done, something she could not undo. And while she spoke, I sensed a deeper truth she refused to say out loud, a truth that pressed itself into the room with more force than her words ever could. I felt the air shift, the weight settle, the night darken around us. Then, far away but unmistakable, I heard sirens cutting across the streets, getting closer with every breath. She looked at me as if I could stop what was coming, as if I could place myself between her and consequences already set in motion. She didn't know what decision was forming inside me, nor the cost of the choice I would make before the night ended, because the truth she carried was heading toward us, and it would demand an answer from me before dawn. The sirens in the distance grew sharper, threading through the stillness of my home like a warning. The walls could no longer hold back. My daughter stood in the center of the living room, her hands pressed against her face, as though hiding behind her own fingers could conceal whatever truth she had carried through my door. I watched her pace without direction, stopping every few steps as if fear had tightened around her ankles. She kept repeating that she needed time, that she needed to think, that she needed a way out before anyone found her. Yet the pauses between her words held more than fear. They held calculation. She wasn't trying to understand what she had done. She was trying to decide how far she could go to escape what was coming. I walked closer, careful not to startle her, and asked what she meant by a mistake she could never undo. Her eyes shifted away from me, and I saw something cold flicker in her expression, an unsettling distance I had never seen in my child. Her voice lowered into a whisper, telling me she had tried to fix it on her own, tried to erase traces, tried to make sure nothing could be traced back to her. Those were her words. I tried to make sure nothing could be traced back to me. They didn't sit like fear, they sat like intent, and that intent cut deeper than any admission could. I felt the air around us grow heavy as she explained half-truths, skipping details, choosing carefully which pieces of the night she was willing to share. She mentioned a road, a sudden moment, a decision to leave, a phone turned off, clothing hidden, a desperate attempt to pretend the night had not happened. My home felt smaller with every sentence, as if the walls were closing in to force the truth into the open. The sirens grew closer, now echoing through the street outside, casting faint blue reflections against the curtains. My daughter stopped pacing, froze in place, and looked at me with a plea I could not answer. Not yet. Her voice trembled when she whispered, "Please do something, please." But she didn't realize that the very thing she begged for was the one thing I could no longer give. The truth she carried wasn't just following her. It was standing on my doorstep, waiting to be let in, and the next knock on my door would reveal just how deep into the darkness she had already fallen. The knock came suddenly, sharp against the wood, breaking the fragile silence that had settled over the house like dust. My daughter froze, a shiver running down her spine, and for a moment, the years of her childhood, the trust, the laughter, the quiet moments we had shared slammed into me with unbearable clarity. I could see her mind racing, weighing every option, calculating every lie she had left in place, every step she could take to escape the consequences she knew were closing in. I didn't move right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, let her feel the weight of the moment fully, let the approaching truth press against her like a storm that could not be outrun. And then I stepped toward the door, my own heartbeat a metronome in the growing tension. The handle rattled. I took a breath, the kind that gathers courage, and opened it. Outside stood the flashing lights, the uniformed presence of authority, the inevitable arrival of reality dressed in blue. I could see her body stiffen, could feel her entire being shrink into itself, as if she were trying to disappear, trying to make the world forget what she had done. I placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, not to protect her, but to anchor her for what was about to come. The officer spoke, words clipped and official, but beneath the protocol, I could sense the ripple of consequences waiting to unfold. My daughter's eyes found mine, searching desperately for a lifeline she no longer deserved. I met her gaze steadily, knowing the choice before me would define both of us in ways nothing else could. "I need to tell you everything," I said, and in that instant, the weight of truth fell like a hammer, echoing across the room, across the night, across the lives that would never be the same. The sirens outside grew louder, closer, unstoppable, and in their wail, I felt the gravity of what had to happen. And the moment I spoke would set into motion a reckoning that neither of us could turn back from. The moment I began to speak, the air in the room thickened, heavy with tension, as if every shadow in the corners had grown teeth and were leaning in to hear the truth. My daughter's breath caught, her hands trembling so violently that I feared she might collapse under the weight of what she had brought into our lives. I told the officer what she had done, every detail she had tried to hide, the choice to drive that night, the loss, the attempts to erase evidence, the running from what could not be undone. She didn't scream, didn't cry, only stared at me as if I had become a stranger in her own home, a betrayer of the very love she had once trusted. And yet, in the silence that followed, I could feel the weight of justice beginning to settle into the room, a cold and precise presence that demanded accountability. The sirens outside now merged with the officer's words, a rhythm of inevitability that pressed against her, against me, against the memory of a life that would never be the same. My daughter's eyes flicked to the floor, and I saw the flicker of panic, the first real understanding of what she had set in motion, what she had tried to escape, and what she could no longer avoid. The room seemed smaller with every heartbeat, every footstep from the officer moving closer, every flash of red and blue spilling through the blinds. I could feel the invisible pull of consequence pressing down on us like a tidal wave, and I knew in that instant that the life she had tried to protect herself from had arrived in full force. I kept my hand lightly on her shoulder, not to soften the blow, not to shield her, but to let her know she was not alone as she faced the storm she had brought upon herself. And even as she sank to the floor, unable to speak, unable to protest, I knew the night was far from over, because in the next moments, the choices we had both made would collide with a truth that could not be contained, and the reckoning had only just begun. The officer stepped closer, his eyes scanning the room, noting the tremor in her hands, the tension in mine, the silence that stretched between us like a thin thread ready to snap. I watched my daughter shrink into herself, trying to disappear under the weight of her own decisions. And for a moment, the years of mothering and protecting surged through me, pulling me toward instinct, toward shielding her from the storm she had brought into our lives. But instinct alone could not rewrite what had been done. I had to hold the line. Carefully, I relayed everything: the accident, the victim who had never stood a chance, the choices she made to cover it up, the lies, the fleeing from accountability. Every word I spoke cut through the room like a blade, leaving only the bare, undeniable truth. She no longer argued, no longer pleaded. The fear in her eyes was absolute, raw, and almost unrecognizable. Outside, the sirens had grown into a persistent scream, a herald of consequences racing toward us, impossible to outrun. I could feel time bending, stretching, as if every second dragged us closer to a point of no return. My own heart thumped against my chest, heavy, deliberate, marking each passing moment with the weight of the decision I had already made. And then the officer spoke again, quieter this time, almost measured, almost merciful. But beneath it lingered the unspoken reality. What had happened could never be undone. My daughter's lips parted, a breathless sound that seemed to plead for mercy from a world that would not grant it. I held her gaze steadily, and in that instant, I realized the truth I had known all along. Love does not mean protecting someone from justice. It means standing beside them while they face the consequences of their own choices. The night pressed closer, shadows pooling in the corners, and every sound, the distant wail of sirens, the creak of floorboards, the hushed whisper of her breathing, hinted at the reckoning yet to come. Because the moment she would be taken from my home, the silence would be broken, and nothing afterward could erase the path her choices had carved into our lives. The moment the officer gestured for her to move, the room seemed to constrict, pressing us into a space thick with dread and inevitability. My daughter's body stiffened, every tremor in her limbs visible, her eyes darting to me as if searching for a way to rewrite the night, a way to undo what had already occurred. I held her gaze and saw a storm of regret, panic, and denial swirling in the depths of her fear. Yet beneath it all, there was a brittle shell of understanding beginning to form, a dawning awareness that the night had chosen its own course, and she could no longer escape it. The sirens outside had become a relentless pulse, a heartbeat measuring the time left before reality would claim its due. She took a step toward the door, hesitated, and then faltered, her breath shallow and uneven, a fragile rhythm betraying her inner chaos. I could feel the tension radiating from her like heat from a flame, the weight of her wrong choices settling in the air between us. Her lips parted, trying to speak, but the words never came. The enormity of the situation had stolen her voice. I knew that voice, once soft and full of trust, would now carry the burden of confession, accountability, and truth. And as I watched her being guided toward the officer, I realized that love and protection could not undo the gravity of the night, could not shield her from the life-altering consequences she had set into motion. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch, elongating with the approaching finality, pressing down on the walls, the ceiling, and our hearts alike. Every footstep she took toward reality resonated like a drumbeat of judgment, echoing in the empty spaces of the home that had once been safe. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as the door creaked open and the night air spilled inside, carrying with it the distant wail of sirens, the weight of what had been lost, and the certainty that nothing could ever return to the way it had been. And as she disappeared into the night, led by the hand of justice, I understood that the choices we make in the dark will always follow us into the light. The door closed behind her with a weight that seemed to press the air from the room, leaving only the echo of her footsteps fading into the night. I stood frozen, my hand still hovering where I had touched her shoulder, the sensation lingering like a ghost of what had just passed. The house felt impossibly quiet, each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of the curtains magnified, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath for what came next. I could still hear the distant sirens, their wailing now punctuated by the faint, solemn rhythm of approaching justice, and I realized that every decision I had made that night was now locked into motion, unstoppable and merciless. My mind replayed her confession in fragments: the accident, the fleeing, the desperate attempts to hide, the choices she had made to erase evidence of the life she had taken. Each memory pressed against my chest like stone, heavy and suffocating, and I felt the truth settle in a cold, undeniable way. Love had demanded that I act against her, that I step aside and let accountability take its place, that I allow the law to touch her in the way only consequences can. I moved through the room, touching the furniture, the walls, searching for some tether to the life before that night, but it had slipped away, leaving only shadows that seemed to whisper of judgment, remorse, and the fragile edge between right and wrong. Outside, the sirens slowed, as if acknowledging the inevitable, the blue and red lights flickering through the blinds like distant flames dancing over a battlefield. And in that quiet aftermath, I understood something harsher than fear. Protection cannot coexist with truth when a life has been lost, and sheltering her from consequence would have been a betrayal to the very soul I had tried to raise. I sank into the nearest chair, the wood cold beneath me, and felt the weight of the night press deeper, heavier, as if the house itself knew there were more decisions to come, more truths to confront, because even when the first step toward justice has been taken, the shadows of choice never fully fade, and what follows in their wake can be darker than any night we have ever known. The hours that followed were heavy, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding the weight of the night and refusing to release it. I moved from room to room, every shadow stretching longer, darker, as though the walls were absorbing the tension that had filled them, pressing it back into me. I could still hear the faint wail of sirens lingering on the street, a reminder that the world outside had not stopped for our tragedy, that reality had continued its course, while my daughter had tried to outrun it. I sat by the window, tracing the red and blue reflections dancing across the floor, and felt the cold truth settle deeper into my bones. I had protected her from no one but myself, and in that act, I had set her on a path that could not be altered. The memory of her pleading voice, the desperation that clung to her every word, replayed endlessly, twisting around my mind like a shadow that refused to let me breathe. And yet, within that darkness, I sensed the first flicker of what justice demanded, a reckoning that was both merciless and necessary, a reminder that no one escapes the consequences of their choices, not even the ones we love most. I remembered the victim, the life extinguished in a single, reckless moment, and the family who would never know peace unless the truth was laid bare, unless the law did its work without interference. My hands trembled as I realized that love and protection had limits, boundaries drawn not by fear, but by morality, by the weight of the lives affected, by the reality that the world does not bend to the desperate wishes of the guilty. Outside, the night deepened, shadows pooling around the trees and the sidewalks, as if the darkness itself were waiting for the next act, the next revelation. I knew, with an undeniable certainty, that the steps I would take in the coming hours would define more than just her fate. They would define the kind of mother I had been, the kind of woman I chose to be in the face of moral collapse. And I also knew that the next knock at the door, the next decision I would have to make, would bring us even closer to the edge of everything we thought we could survive. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, the house felt like a mausoleum, heavy with shadows that stretched longer than the night itself. My daughter sat on the edge of the sofa, hands wrapped around her knees, staring at a world she no longer recognized, the world she had fractured with one reckless decision. I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the flicker of panic that had yet to settle into acceptance, and the subtle curl of defiance, the final grasp of denial that refused to break entirely. Outside, the sirens had faded into distant echoes, replaced by the muted hum of a city unaware of the storm that had swept through our small, quiet home. I moved beside her, careful not to touch her, careful not to intrude, letting the silence fill the space as heavily as any words could. And yet, the silence was restless, filled with the weight of consequences, the unspoken acknowledgement that what had been done could never be undone. I replayed the events in my mind, each fragment sharper than the last: the car, the road, the sound of impact, the instant when panic had overtaken judgment, the desperate measures to cover the crime. Each memory pressed against me like a blade, demanding clarity, demanding action, demanding truth. I realized then that hiding her, sheltering her from what had been set in motion, had been impossible from the very start. Justice would not wait for my hesitation, would not bend to my mercy. The thought of the victim, of the family who deserved answers, burned in my chest, reminding me that the night's reckoning extended far beyond the walls of my home. And as I glanced at her, still trapped in a web of fear, regret, and the remnants of denial, I understood that the hardest part was yet to come, not for me, but for her, for the life she had altered forever, and for the choices that would now define every moment of her future. Because the moment she would face the consequences fully, the truth of her actions would no longer belong to her alone. It would ripple outward, consuming everything that had once felt safe. The call finally came, sharp and insistent, slicing through the fragile quiet of the morning like a knife. It was the officer, confirming that they would return to take her into custody, to enforce the consequences she had long tried to evade. My daughter's face went pale, her lips parting in a soundless plea, the kind of look that carries the weight of someone realizing the full scope of their actions too late. She stepped back, instinctively, as if the walls themselves could shield her from what was coming, as if the light of day could somehow wash away the darkness she had created. I held my gaze on her, steady and unwavering, feeling the tension curl through the room like smoke from a fire I could not extinguish. Every heartbeat measured the passage of time until the inevitable, each one echoing with the memory of the choices she had made, the reckless decisions, the fleeing, the attempts to hide what could not be hidden. Outside, the sirens began again, distant at first, then rising in a crescendo that promised the arrival of consequences with a precision and inevitability that could not be deflected. I could see her trying to reconcile the mother she had once known with the woman who now stood between her and justice, and I knew that no words I could offer would undo the path she had set herself upon. The room felt impossibly small, shadows pooling in the corners like sentinels of the truth, bearing witness to every tremor of fear, every flicker of denial, every shiver of recognition that the night had claimed what she could not reclaim. And in that moment, I understood something that chilled me deeper than any fear, that love does not always protect, that sometimes standing by means stepping forward, even when it breaks the heart, and that justice waits for no hesitation. I reached out one last time, not to shield her, not to alter fate, but to anchor her for the storm she had summoned. And as the first knock rang through the house, I knew that the reckoning she had run from was finally at the door, because the moment the door opened, nothing could hide the truth from the world outside, and what followed would change everything forever. The knock came again, louder this time, resonating through the walls like a pulse I could not ignore. My daughter flinched, her hands gripping the edges of the sofa, knuckles white, eyes wide with a terror that had nothing to do with childhood fears and everything to do with the weight of her choices. I stayed close, a steady presence, though every nerve in my body screamed that nothing could soften what was coming. The officer's voice carried through the door, calm, professional. But beneath the surface, I could sense the gravity, the immovable authority of consequence, finally confronting the reckless chaos she had unleashed. My daughter's lips trembled as she attempted to speak, as if words could conjure some escape. But I knew better. There were no words now, no excuses, no fleeting strategies to bend reality in her favor. I felt her fear ripple through the room, a tangible force pressing against my chest. But I could not give in. I had to be the one who stood firm, who ensured that justice, no matter how painful, would be served. She looked at me, eyes pleading for a shield I could not offer, and I felt a cold clarity. Love in its truest form sometimes means stepping aside, sometimes means letting the world take its due, no matter the cost to your heart. Outside, the morning light crept across the street, the red and blue reflections of the patrol car flashing in rhythm with my own quickening pulse. Her breath hitched as the officer's hand moved to knock again, closer this time, closer than she could bear, and I felt the finality pressing in, the invisible walls closing, the reckoning breathing down our necks, the inevitable moment when hiding could no longer exist. And in that long, suspended pause, I understood that this night, this confrontation, would define her life and mine forever. Because when the door opens this time, nothing will be the same, and the shadows we tried to outrun will finally consume the truth. The door creaked under the officer's hand, each fraction of a second stretching out like the slow pull of inevitability. My daughter's body froze, every muscle taut with fear, every thought scrambling for escape where none existed. I could feel the tension coil around us, thick and unyielding, as if the very air in the room had turned to iron, pressing down with the weight of what had been done and what could not be undone. Outside, the sirens had quieted, replaced by the faint hum of the world moving on, unaware of the tragedy that had pierced our lives. But inside, time had slowed to a crawl. I watched as she sank to her knees, eyes fixed on the floor, trembling so violently it was as if the very act of standing might shatter her. I felt her panic reach into me, trying to pull me into the chaos. But I held firm, my voice steady, my presence unwavering. I told her once more, in whispers she could hear, that hiding would not change reality, that shielding herself from justice was impossible, and that the moment had come to face the truth fully. The officer's knock rang out again, insistent, and she flinched, as though the sound itself were a sentence being read aloud. I stepped slightly forward, not to intervene, not to protect, but to anchor her, to to let her know that while consequences were inevitable, she would not face them completely alone. Shadows in the corners stretched and writhed like dark fingers, echoing the weight pressing down from every angle. Every heartbeat a reminder that the past could not be rewritten. I saw the flicker of comprehension cross her face, the recognition that the choices she had made in desperation had led here, and that nothing, no pleading, no lies, no attempt at concealment, could undo what was set in motion. And in that suspended, suffocating moment, I realized that the night's reckoning was only beginning, that the next step, the very instant the door opened fully, would cast us into a reality neither of us could escape, because the truth, once fully revealed, has a way of demanding everything, and the cost of it would fall on both of us in ways we had yet to understand. The moment the door opened fully, a cold rush of air swept into the room, carrying with it the weight of inevitability, a presence that had been hovering outside, waiting for us to act. My daughter flinched violently, her body curling inward as if she could disappear beneath the floorboards, as if the shadows themselves might swallow her before the world could. The officer stepped inside, eyes scanning the room with a quiet authority, unyielding and precise, each movement measured, every glance demanding the truth. I felt the pulse of fear radiate from her in waves, tangible, almost suffocating, yet I remained steady, my hands at my sides, my voice calm, my gaze unbroken. I spoke her name softly, a tether to the last threads of trust between us, and she looked up at me with wide, unblinking eyes, realizing for the first time that the reality she had tried so desperately to avoid had arrived in full force. I could see every calculation she had made, every lie she had spun to evade the night's consequences, shattering under the weight of what was coming. Her chest heaved as though each breath was a struggle to contain panic, shame, and the dawning comprehension that nothing, not even her mother's presence, could halt the path she had set herself upon. The room seemed to shrink around us, shadows deepening, corners pressing closer, each tick of the second hand on the clock a drumbeat of the reckoning that had been building since the moment she stepped into my home. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the storm inside. But here, inside these walls, time was suspended, every heartbeat a reminder that justice does not wait, and that the choices we make in darkness will eventually meet the light. I felt a cold clarity settle over me. The night was no longer mine to protect her from. It was mine to witness, to endure, and to guide her through in the only way left, truth. And as the officer extended a hand toward her, signaling the moment of surrender, I knew that the next step she would take would seal the path we could not turn back from, and that the shadows following her would stretch far beyond this night, because the consequences, once embraced, have a way of reshaping every life they touch. And the moment of reckoning was only beginning. She rose slowly, her body rigid, eyes wide with a mixture of fear, shame, and a flicker of defiance that had survived every moment of hesitation. The officer's hand was steady, precise, offering no comfort, only the unwavering weight of duty, and she placed her own into it, as if crossing a threshold into a world she had long tried to escape. Every step she took toward the patrol car echoed like a drumbeat of inevitability, reverberating through the empty rooms of my home, bouncing off walls that had once been filled with laughter and now only held the ghosts of mistakes. I followed a pace behind her, not to interfere, not to shield, but to bear witness, to see the daughter I loved confront the consequences of the choices she had made. I felt the air thicken with the gravity of what was unfolding, shadows folding in tighter, pressing the moment into sharp relief. while my own chest constricted under the weight of understanding that love sometimes cannot protect. Outside, the city moved as if unaware, the faint hum of early morning traffic contrasting sharply with the suffocating stillness inside, a reminder that life continues even when ours had been irrevocably altered. She glanced at me once, the barest hint of recognition, before the officer guided her to the waiting vehicle, the doors clicking shut like the final sentence of a story she could no longer rewrite. I watched as the car drove away, lights flashing, carrying with it not just her body, but the consequences, the accountability, and the justice that had been denied too long. The night had stretched endlessly, every heartbeat a measure of terror, guilt, and revelation. But in this final moment, I felt the cold clarity of truth settle like frost over the room. The path she had taken could not be undone, and every choice that night had shaped not only her future, but the very foundation of our family. And as the tires disappeared around the corner, leaving only silence and the echo of what had been done, I realized the reckoning was far from over, and the shadows of that night would follow us long after the lights had faded. The house fell into a silence so profound it felt almost unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath after witnessing the departure of what had carried the night's storm. I sat down heavily in the armchair, the weight of every choice, every word, every step pressing into me with relentless force. Outside, the first pale light of morning cut across the windows, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the air like tiny specters of a night that could never be erased. I thought of her, my daughter, her trembling hands, the look in her eyes when she realized there would be no escape, no shortcut, no way to undo what she had done. The image of her surrender, the acceptance of the consequences she had long tried to avoid, burned in my mind, a sharp and unyielding reminder that justice does not wait for mercy, and truth does not bend to protect fear. My thoughts flicked to the victim, to the life extinguished in a moment of reckless choice, and to the family left behind, whose mourning had begun the moment she hit the road. I felt a cold weight settle deep into my chest, a combination of grief, guilt, and a clarity so raw it cut like ice. Love is not always about shielding those we care for. It is about guiding them to face the storm they have summoned, no matter how unbearable. Shadows lingered in the corners of the room, stretching longer as the morning light shifted, reminders that the darkness of that night had not fully receded, that the consequences would continue to echo in every moment we had left. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the windows carried the memory of what had passed and the knowledge of what was still to come. And as I stared at the empty space where she had been, I realized with a chill certainty that the night's reckoning was not confined to a single act, a single moment, or a single consequence. It would ripple through every heartbeat, every thought, every decision from this point forward, because even after surrender, even after justice begins its course, the shadows of what has been done never fully leave, and they are waiting to confront us again. The hours that followed felt like wading through a fog, every movement sluggish, every sound amplified by the emptiness that had settled over the house. I moved through the rooms slowly, touching surfaces, searching for remnants of normalcy that no longer existed. Her absence left a void, a silent reminder that the consequences of one night could stretch longer than a lifetime. I replayed her trembling face, the sharp panic in her voice, the way her hands had clutched mine, as if seeking a lifeline that could not exist. Outside, the streets were waking to the light of day, oblivious to the reckoning that had passed through our home, oblivious to the quiet devastation that followed in the wake of truth. The The reality settled in my chest like a stone. The life she had tried to protect, the freedom she had sought in secrecy, was gone, replaced by accountability, by justice, and by the painful understanding that some actions cannot be undone. I thought of the victim, of the family whose lives had been shattered in an instant, and the full weight of responsibility pressed upon me, both hers and mine. I realized then that the act of allowing justice to proceed, of stepping aside, had been necessary, though it left a hollowness I could not fill. Shadows still lingered in the corners, stretching and twisting, as if feeding on the tension and fear. And in the quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat echoing the memory of the night, reminding me that even the most painful truths leave marks that never fade. And as I sat there, staring into the dim light of morning, I understood that the night's consequences would not be confined to the moments that had passed. They would follow us, lingering, watching, waiting for the next ripple, the next decision, the next confrontation. Because sometimes, even when justice has been served, the echoes of one night refuse to be silenced, and the darkness is never truly gone. The days that followed blurred together, each one heavy with the weight of absence and the relentless reminder of that night. The house felt colder, emptier, haunted not by ghosts, but by memories, her voice, her panic, her pleading, and the final steps she had taken toward the consequences she could no longer avoid. I moved through the rooms, as though navigating a landscape reshaped by tragedy. Every object, every shadow a marker of the choices that had been made. Outside, life carried on, indifferent to the fracture that had carved itself into our family, indifferent to the burden of justice, the ache of accountability, the hollowness left by what had been lost. I thought often of the victim, of the life cut short in a heartbeat, of the family left to grapple with grief and anger, and I felt the sharp, bitter edge of truth settle over me. Love had demanded that I act against instinct, that I step aside and let reality take its course, no matter the cost to my heart, no matter the devastation it would bring to the one I had tried to protect. And yet, in the quiet moments between memories, I sensed the shadows of that night stretching further, threading through every thought, every glance, every silent space, reminding me that consequences, once set in motion, do not remain confined to a single moment. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw her trembling form, the wide eyes, the shallow breaths, the desperate attempt to evade what was already inevitable. And in that vision, I understood with a chilling clarity that the reckoning was not over, that the echoes of her choices, the shadows of the night, would continue to reach for us, demanding acknowledgement, demanding confrontation, because the truth we face does not sleep, it does not tire, and it never truly leaves, always waiting, always watching, always ready to pull us back into the darkness we thought we had survived. The nights that followed carried a different kind of weight, heavier than the chaos of that first evening, quieter, but no less suffocating. I lay awake, listening to the wind brushing against the windows, the distant hum of a city moving on, as if the tragedy that had passed through our home had never existed. Shadows pooled in the corners of every room, reminding me that the darkness of one night does not simply fade, it lingers, taking root in the spaces where fear, guilt, and truth collide. I remembered her pleading eyes, the tremor in her hands, the desperate whispers she had tried to offer me, hoping for shelter from what she knew was inevitable. And yet, as I replayed the night in my mind, I saw the clarity in the choices I had made, the decision to step aside, to let justice unfold, to face reality even when my heart screamed against it. Each memory pressed into me with a weight that was almost unbearable. The accident, the life taken, the attempts to hide, the surrender, the silent acknowledgement that she would face the consequences. Outside, the faint sounds of traffic and distant sirens threaded through the quiet, reminders that the world never stops, never waits, never forgives. I could feel the invisible pull of what was yet to come, the ripples of her actions stretching further than either of us could measure, touching lives, altering futures, leaving marks that could never be erased. Every breath I took carried the echo of that night, every heartbeat a reminder that love cannot undo what truth demands. And as the shadows of the house seemed to lean closer, gathering in silent patience, I understood something with a stark, unyielding clarity. The reckoning was far from over, and the darkness we thought had passed would return in ways we had yet to face. Because some nights do not end, they only change shape, waiting for the moment we least expect to remind us of the choices we cannot escape. The days stretched into weeks, each one a slow march through a world that had grown colder, quieter, heavier with the memory of that night. I moved through the house like a shadow, each creak of the floorboards, each gust of wind against the windows, reminding me that nothing would ever return to the way it had been. My daughter's absence was a constant ache, a presence in itself, echoing in every empty room, every abandoned chair, every photograph that no longer captured innocence, but a moment before irrevocable choices. I thought often of the victim, of the family whose lives had been torn apart in seconds, and of the weight of truth pressing against us, all like a relentless tide. I remembered the pleading, trembling eyes she had turned toward me, searching for a lifeline I could not give, and I understood fully what love demanded in that instant. Not protection, not denial, but the courage to let justice unfold, to confront the unbearable consequences, even when it shattered the heart. Nights came, long and unforgiving, filled with the quiet hum of life moving outside, while the darkness inside pressed heavier with every heartbeat. Shadows clung to the corners, stretching, twisting, feeding on memory and fear, reminding me that some choices cannot be buried, some truths cannot be silenced, and some consequences will follow us relentlessly, waiting for the moment we think the storm has passed. I sat by the window, staring at the street where her car had once sped toward a tragedy that changed everything, feeling the cold truth of my decisions settle deep into my bones. And as the first hint of night began to creep into the sky once more, I knew that the reckoning was not yet complete, that the echoes of that single, devastating choice would demand one final confrontation, one that would leave us with nothing to hide and nothing to undo. Because when the shadows return for the last time, the full weight of the truth must be faced, and there will be no turning back. The day she was taken to face the full measure of her actions arrived like a storm breaking over a fragile coastline, inevitable and merciless. I watched her step into the waiting car, her shoulders trembling, her face pale beneath the mask of composure she had worn for weeks, and I felt a hollow ache in my chest that no words could ease. The officer's hand guided her firmly, unyielding yet professional, and I realized that justice, like the tide, cannot be held back by fear, by pleading, or by the desperate attempts of love to intervene. I stayed at the doorway, watching the car roll away, the street emptying around it, the weight of truth pressing down on every step, every breath, every heartbeat. For the first time, I allowed myself to feel the full gravity of what had been lost, the life extinguished, the innocence shattered, the trust broken, the family forever marked by the consequences of one reckless night. And yet, within that darkness, I found a shard of clarity. By stepping aside, by allowing accountability to take its course, I had honored something far greater than fear or protection. I had honored truth, justice, and the memory of a life that deserved recognition. The silence of the house settled around me, heavy but resolute, and I understood that while sorrow would linger, the shadows of that night would gradually lose their power over us. In the quiet aftermath, I whispered to the wind, to the echoes of her trembling voice, and to the absent life that had touched us so irrevocably, that love is not the sheltering of wrongs, but the courage to stand beside those we care for as they face the consequences of their choices. And as the final light of day sank into the horizon, painting the world with the pale gold of inevitability, I turned to you, dear friends, with a heart both heavy and resolute. Please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It helps stories like this be heard. Thank you from the deepest part of my heart for listening and for witnessing a truth we could not escape.